everyone. We're starting. Welcome to the session. The European Union goes decentralized. We're going to talk about standards and technical architecture behind eIDAS 2.0. My name is Kristina. I work at Microsoft as Identity Standards Architect. And
hey, my name is Torsten Lodderstedt. I work at Yes, and I do standards. And we have prepared that presentation with Giuseppe De Marco, who unfortunately couldn't come to Las Vegas. He is the representative of Italy in the expert group. We will tell you what the expert group is later. So let's start with eIDAS. I would like to get a sense. Who of you in the room knows what eIDAS is? Please raise your hand. Oh my God, that's amazing.
It's more than we expected.
Okay, but not all of you seem to know what eIDAS is. So let me give you a short overview. So eIDAS is one regulation. Regulations are European Union law. So whatever is defined in that law is binding law for all the member states in the European Union. And eIDAS is a regulation about digital identity. The first version was published in 2014, and it defined a framework for two kinds of services. First is eID. As you may know, all member states in the meantime in the European Union have a government-issued ID. And in eIDAS, there is a definition how this ID is used in digital transactions. So there is the eID part of it, and the aim and the purpose is that citizens or inhabitants of the European Union can use their electronic ID across borders in cross-border transactions in other member states. That doesn't work. And the second part is on trust services. And trust services are, for example, electronic signing. So there is a class of service providers called Qualified Trusted Service Provider that offer users to create electronic signatures, mostly cloud-based, but with a very high security level. So the qualified electronic signature under eIDAS is legally binding. So you can sign with that signature, and it's really legally binding in the same way as your wet signature, but much more secure. And over time, there was an assessment, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and it's consensus that the eID portion of eIDAS hasn't worked. And in 2020, a new revision was started, and it aims at making things better, generally, but also embracing the idea of decentralized identity. So previously, all the regulation, the technical implementations were mostly based on federated identity systems and cloud services. And now the next step is to go into decentralized identity, improve the eID part of it, but also increase the scope and provide inhabitants of the European Union with wallets that can be used to maintain and present all kinds of what we would call verifiable credentials. There's a different terminology. We will dig into that.
I think it's important to ground what do we mean when we say decentralized, because different people seem to interpret it differently. What's contrasted here, as opposed to identity provider talking directly as a relying party, there is this wallet component that is controlled by the user being in the middle, right? So relying party is talking to that wallet component. European Digital Identity Wallet is what we mean. So we're not talking about decentralizing databases, or it doesn't require decentralized identifiers or anything like that, right? Just to be clear.
eIDAS 2 is very ambitious. It's much more ambitious than eIDAS 1 was. So we have a list of use cases here, for example. As I said, it's not only about identification. That's the first use case. It's also about maintaining, for example, medical prescriptions in the wallet, or store and present other kinds of digital documents, including a driver's license. Yes, we also have a driver's license, but it's not used for identification, right? That's where we have our ID card or other means for. And signing contracts is in scope as well as payments. So it's a pretty huge scope. And that's also a reason why, if you look onto that from a technical standpoint, there's a need for different, I would say, categories of credentials. So on that slide, you see in the middle, you see the European Digital Identity Wallet, and you see the different types or categories of credentials that might be used. And there's a differentiation between personal identity data, called PID, that you see on top, and attestation of attributes, which is a term for all other kinds of validated attributes in a wallet. And those can be qualified or non-qualified. Qualified underlie a certain regulatory regime, and non-qualified are any kind of verified credentials, I would say. And the different categories have different requirements associated with it. So for example, a PID, a VC of type 1, needs to have hardware-based security. So it needs to fulfill the highest security requirements because it is used for identification, in anti-money laundering, in whatever, right? But there are other credentials, like the membership pass, that do not require such high security level, and that's why there are different categories described in a technical architecture for eIDAS. And you already see on the left-hand side, there are different kinds of providers. We will dig into that later on. And as you also can see already, there are a couple of technical standards being mentioned on that slide. Kristina will dig into that later in the show. So let's talk about the project as a whole. So who of you knows how the European Union works?
It works? It does.
Okay. From a structural standpoint, there are three sources of power. There's the European Commission, that's the government. There's the Parliament, the people elected by the people, and there's the Council. The Council is the representatives of the member states' governments. Those are the three powers. And the first proposal of eIDAS was published by the European Commission. And then the Parliament and the Council came up with their own ideas. That's the way the process works. And those proposals were different. And now they are in a process that's called a trilogue, where they are negotiating with each other and trying to come up with one consolidated version, because all the three parties need to agree in the end to really make that a legislation in the European Union. That process is still in the making, and the hope is that by the end of the year, the legislation in the end will be adopted. It's very important because in the end, from a technical standpoint, a lot of requirements are still unclear because they are defined in the law. So for example, there is the idea of a persistent, unique person identifier. You might not know, but the Germans are going crazy about this kind of stuff, right? So there is some political tension associated with that. And, well, let's see. And then there are other processes going on. There is what's called the expert group. Already mentioned that, right? The expert group are mostly representatives of the member states, and they are trying to figure out what could be the best technical solutions, what are the technical standards, the architecture, and so on, that we could use to implement and roll out eIDAS. This is pretty unique, and Kristina will also talk about that, because this has never been done before. In the past, there was just a legislation, and technical interoperability across the European Union did not play that important role. That has changed. And then there's a third element, which is also pretty new and unique, because the Commission wants to really have a solution that works across the European Union. They believe that an implementation, a reference implementation of the European Digital Identity Wallet might help the member states and other parties to get it right. And that's why they're investing in the implementation of that reference wallet application that is developed alongside the process of the definition of the architecture reference framework. And then this all is put to tests. And that's why we have the large-scale pilots. The large-scale pilots are 4 different projects with pretty large consortium that all have one in common. They all are cross-member states. So at least 3 member states need to participate in such a pilot because the use cases that are tested in those large-scale pilots shall be cross-border. Every of these large-scale pilots has a different focus. So DC4EU, for example, is more into education and social security. Nobit does payment. Potential is focusing on, I would say, core identity, mobile driver's license, and that stuff. And EWC is focusing on a seamless travel experience and legal entities. So the different consortiums will test different use cases. That's the idea. So this all together shall help us to really come up with something that makes sense and works. And with that, I'll pass over to Kristina.
Thank you, Torsten. So just to connect the dots, the project's ambitious, right? And the component why this has higher chances to achieve interoperability and brings us European digital identity wallets to the European citizens is ARF, stands for Architecture Reference Framework, right? So this is a document that actually defines what issuers, wallets, and verifiers have to implement to be able to talk to each other across the European Union, right? And it is being drafted by a group called eIDAS Experts Group, which is composed of members from a member state. And Torsten and I both participate in this experts group as through the liaison between OpenID Foundation and European Commission, because some of the standards being worked on in the OpenID Foundation have been selected by ARF. So originally it was published January this year, but there's a revision in February. If you Google EIDIW ARF, you'll get it. The SEO seems to be working. So the document has the use cases you already mentioned in the beginning: authentication, mobile driving license, house, finance, travels, and education, right? And it does define the roles that each component, each entity is supposed to play, which we're going to double click on the next slide. And it does define in a pretty detailed manner technically what is supposed to be supported from the standards perspective. And then it does define some flows and also credential types. Yep, and right now there's a reference implementation being developed, which would be open source. So if you're willing to contribute, that's a good idea. This is the slide directly from the ARF. To kind of color code first, the wallet is in the center. So the purple is the wallet instance. So it means the wallet on the actual user's device, right? And then yellow is kind of the entities components. And a really important part is like the trust, right? How do you trust each component? Because identifying and being able to verify the signature is not sufficient. You need to be able to know, why do you trust that entity you actually identified, right? Why do I accept credential from a certain entity? Why do I trust this wallet? Why do I trust this verifier? So that's the threat component on the side. And there is a different issuers, providers, and a wallet gets issued different credentials into it, and the authentic source is what's needed for EAA to become a qualified electronic attestation of attributes. Actually said it, EAA. And there's the relying party on this side, actual wallet provider, which is different from the instance. Again, of course, user in the middle, and kind of a trust fabric underlying in the middle. And as you can see, each entity have to assume to have some sort of registration process. It's being under consideration, under discussion, but the trust is, there would be a root of trust, essentially. This is, again, a slide from the ARF itself. So now we're going to dig deeper a bit in the more technical components, for those who are thinking of actually building it, and to give an idea what are the thoughts. I actually like this much more, so I'll use this. It's pretty much the same components that Giuseppe has recreated. So from the issuance protocol perspective, OpenID for verifiable credential issuance is a protocol that is currently being mandated. There is a small asterisk. If you have an existing system working, that is potentially an option, but ideally to use verifiable credential issuance. This protocol is built on OAuth, so it allows you to extend your existing infrastructure. If you already have an authorization server, you have additional REST access token protected endpoint. If not, there's another mechanism to authenticate. Come to our session tomorrow if you're interested. And this is issuance of these attributes, right, on the left-hand side. Pointer. On the right-hand side is the presentation, right? And from the European Commission perspective, it's important to account for both. What am I doing wrong? It's not pointing. Sorry. The representation perspective, important to have offline use cases and online use cases, right? So from offline, right now it's 18.13-5. So that's a presentation of the verifiable attributes over NFC, Bluetooth, the protocols that work without an internet connection. And also for online use cases, OpenID for verifiable presentations. That's another protocol being worked on in OpenID Foundation, and for pseudonymous authentication, self-issued OpenID provider, that's SIOP v2, but that's under, yeah, that's a current status. And to dig, so we have, in terms of credential formats, there are two formats supported right now. One is MDocs in CBOR format, which are defined in 18.13-5. So that's the one you use for offline presentation, and online too. You can use MDocs for both offline over 18.13-5 and over OpenID for VP. Second format is, maybe you've heard the presentation earlier today in the same room by Brian. The second format is selective disclosure for JOTs. So if you're thinking that JOTs, there's one issuer signature on top of it, what do you mean selectively disclosable? Well, there's a new mechanism. There is a draft specification being worked on in IETF. And because selective disclosure was, again, a really important data minimization principle that the European Commission really cared about. And really, the two formats are there to meet all the use cases that the European Commission is trying to meet, right? Because there are 6, and the current assessment that it's pretty challenging to meet all the use cases with one. And again, adoption is key, right? So to justify the investment, to make the European citizens happy, there needs to be a place where to use the credentials. So the wider the reach, the better. So there's also another incentive behind two credential formats right now. And so type 1, type 2, beyond that, they're also kind of, so there's 2 sets of type 1, type 2, I think Torsten already explained, with different security level. So that's what there are 2 types. And
may
yeah, go ahead.
May I add? So the major difference between type 1 and type 2 is that type 1 is must be hardware bound, meaning the credential is issued to the user, and the user has to prove possession of a key that is maintained by the wallet on behalf of the user in a hardware security element or a trusted execution environment. So even if someone can steal the credential, it's unable to present the proof of possession for the private key. However, that is a bit limiting if you want a backend recovery, for example, your credentials. So there are a category of credentials where you would like to do that, and that's why type 2, for example, allows for exportable keys, and it also allows for other credential formats. So it's the more flexible credential format, because right now it's not clear, right, what use cases will use or have what requirements. So the idea is to have a really narrowly defined type 1 for the higher security stuff, and type 2 is more for experiments in the large-scale pilots. I guess in the end, the optionality will be reduced further to improve interoperability. But that's still to see.
Thank you. That was great. And this is a starting point that's in the current architecture reference framework, right? As all your practitioners who've built the systems, you know that there are other components you would need. Entity identifiers, how do you get the keys, what the trust infrastructure, do we use X5 or 9s, do we use more of the PKI-based approach, and that is what's being brushed up right now, and that's why there is agile mechanism of large-scale pilots, which is a really important component. Large-scale pilots would start here, implement and give feedback on what works, what doesn't, what should be in there, what shouldn't. So ideally, it's really the process that is helps to have a scalable infrastructure, right? Because we're talking about the all European citizens. It has to scale, it has to work smoothly. So large-scale pilots are pilots that are going to help us to know what actually works and what doesn't. So yeah, it's pretty much.
I just wanted to add that in the end, what the European, I already said, right, that whole project is very ambitious. And I'm not aware of any project that does decentralized identity on that scale, right? We're talking about 300 million plus users in the end, and 27 different member states, several member states, right? So there is a lot that needs to be figured out. And if you take a look under the current state of technology, for example, trust management and all that stuff is not really understood yet. So there's a lot of fun for us in it, right? To experiment with all this stuff, but it's a long way to go. I mean, over dinner, over lunch, I also said, I wish my OpenID Connect OP back, right? So, because it's super simple. One credential format, direct interaction, super easy to secure, right? We understand how that works. There are a lot of open topics here that needs to be addressed, and that's why the expert group is there to address those topics. Yeah. And I think that will have an impact on the technology that's available for decentralized identity generally. It will drive evolution of this kind of technology.
Yes, if you were in the Jeremy Grant's presentation, he had a bullet point saying US does not have a plan for digital identity. Looks like European Union has. And just to summarize, the key message on this slide is that you can do ISO MDocs over OpenID for VC, because that is usually misunderstood concepts. And PID has to be issued in two formats, which is simple to key messages here. And so I already mentioned, but there's things that are defined and are not yet defined. And to Torsten's point, this work really pushes the whole forming ecosystem to find the great, product market fit / to solve the hard problems that people could have avoided before in POCs or, have been avoided because they're hard. And now, if we really want this to work, which we do, we have to solve, right? So what is defined is basic technical specs and standards, each rows of each entity, terms, requirements. But yeah, the hard part, trust model, needs to be sorted out. Revocation / credential lifecycle management. As Torsten said, in the current federation model, issuer issues directly, right? Real time. It's fresh. It's still valid. It can be revoked within a few seconds that you got it over the wire, right? So, but now the credential could have been issued a year ago. How do you know it's still valid? So that status management is a complexity introduced with this three-party model. Privacy and security considerations really important. You need to be careful with this, obviously. And right now, ARF mainly focuses on natural persons, but legal person identifiers are also in scope, so that's probably the next challenge. And anything you might be missing has to be defined, right, to make it work. So that's, I think, all we have for content.
Yeah, I would like to add one more thought on that. The advantage of this pressure is, the pressure to deliver on large scale is, it creates pragmatism. I really like that. And it also drives the selection process for technology. And you might or might not be surprised to hear there's no blockchain in it.
He took my key phrase. Usually I say that.
There's also no DID in it right now, right? There's a pro and con, right? I think we need to be innovative, but we also have to make pragmatic decisions to get things work. So the right balance between new stuff and existing stuff that works is very important. So just to give you an example, Under eIDAS 1, the infrastructure that was set up for the trust service providers is based on X509 and Etsy trusted lists. I mean, no one really likes X509, but it works. And there's an infrastructure. So I personally would prefer to use that, but and do innovation in other parts where it's really needed, in the credential part and so on. But we will see how that's going to work. Yeah, just as a data point. Yeah, yeah, and then.
Yeah, so that's where Europe wants to go. Are there any questions? Yes.
Is there an end date, or is it just it's done when it's done?
Is there a timeline?
That would be great, right? It's done when it's done. Right now, the assumption is that the legislation is put into effect somewhere around 26. So, because first of all, the legislation needs to be fixed. Then there are the large-scale pilots that run up until 25 around-ish. And then the member states are obliged. Oh, we didn't mention that. The member states are obliged to provide all the citizens and inhabitants with a European digital identity wallet. Either they do that themselves, they delegate that, or they set up a scheme where private entities can operate those. So which means there needs to be also processes to certify all those, huh? Ralph, you know what that means. So it's going to be around 26, yeah. But I think, if you ask me when it's really going to work in an interoperable fashion, 10 years from now. I don't know who was first.
He was first, yeah.
So what we should be adding in proof of concept for, let's say, for tests is device changes, user changes in device. Yeah. It's a headache today to do that for your bank accounts and whatnot. Yeah. That will be even not a headache when you need to go to some station, whatever, to certify authenticity of the person. Yeah. That is the one to get his wallet back. Yeah. So, well, because maybe some keys aren't exportable, as you mentioned. So.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, the assumption for the PID is that that's going to be reissued if you change the device. So, and the reissuance will be based on the existing identity.
If you still have it and it's not stolen, etc., etc.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. Thank you.
And that's the thing, the relationship between the issued data versus a pseudonymous identifier, because whether the citizen will have to send the actual data over the wire every single time, or it's enough to just authenticate is, it would be an interesting question to solve too.
So the second one, given some of the challenges around national sovereignty in terms of creating that mesh, you've got the eIDAS 1 QTSP trust list, which nobody really verifies. They are like elders, certificate authorities, and then just add them. What's the thinking about that C group of trust from which that delegation flows? And has any of the member states raised potential sovereignty concerns even amongst the EU about the ability for, I don't know, if they decide to leave and all of those credentials that have been issued changing down?
So Ralph asked for the ultimate root of trust. Are you referring for the ultimate root of trust for the PID, for the eID, or for the wallet, or what?
Anything that that member state is responsible for the cross-border for.
Yeah. Okay.
UK, France.
Yeah. So the trust list that is used right now only maintains trust regarding private entities. It's the trust service providers. Right now there's a process for the eID, it's called a notification process. There is no official list on that. There is an official list on that, but it's not a technical list. So the member states recognize each other's eID scheme. Right now, the assumption is there will be a certification process for the different wallets and the PID systems. And the member state also notifies the European Union, because it's very important. The member states takes all the liability for this solution. So it's the member state solution. And it's the member state's sovereign decision to notify the Commission of it.
So the flip side then is if the member state any major changes to that member state, it's going to take time for that process and those sort of its own root anchors to be accepted in a mesh network, still very similar to eIDAS 1. Because one of the challenges we always had was there was no root of trust for eIDAS. You couldn't revoke the Ministry of Defence, say, just by revoking their root cert. There was different levels of sovereignty within that issuance criteria. And so some of the challenges about how do I agree these lists are built and this mesh network grows, how is that actually rolled out in a manageable way?
As I pointed out, trust is a key aspect, and I think that the management of the trust in such a system is even much more complex than we have right now. And I don't think anyone has all the solutions yet, right? We need to figure out.
It's a great question. Yeah, there's a question.
What is the decentralized part? Just so I know, is it the architecture? Is it new to V2 that it's decentralized? I just want to make sure I understand that. Is it the architecture that you were showing? What is it that makes it decentralized? I'm trying to understand.
What makes it decentralized is that the
issuer eID is different than the provider. It's not just one issuer. The title.
yeah, basically, I mean, the difference between the federated and the decentralized system typically is that the data is released by the issuer and then maintained under the control of the user in the wallet, and that's what we try to illustrate on that picture, right? In the middle, that's the wallet under control of the user, and that's the major difference, because right now most eID systems are federated, so you're relying on that service to prove your identity. Now you will have the wallet where you have all your credentials in the end. That's one element, and the other element is scope-wise. We're not only talking about identity. My assumption is identity will be just a small portion. There are a lot of different digital certificates, assertions, attestations, and so on that will go into that wallet as well. So the variety of different issuers will be much bigger than we have it today.
So yeah, right now, the RP would go to the issuer would redirect to the user, issuer will authenticate the user, and based on that, the identity provider will release the data directly to the relying party, right? Versus now, RP, relying party, will send a request directly to the wallet. It's the wallet who have to authenticate the user, and then based on that, user consent, authorization, release the information directly to the relying party. So the relying party is not talking directly to the issuer. So issuer does not know when and where and with whom the user is presenting which information.
And that also has another consequence. It's not only privacy preserving, obviously. It also allows you to use the credential in different channels. That's what we see on the right-hand side. Right before, it was only online. Now we see convergence. So you can use that credentials also in the offline. And so, for example, there's another regulation being worked on for the driver's license in the European Union. And the ultimate goal is to really get rid of the plastic cards, so that the digital form of the driver's license is the primary form you carry your driver's license with you, which also means you. Say it again?
I still have mine in paper.
Oh no, really? You're obliged to change over the next coming years. But you can directly migrate to the digital version then, yeah? That sounds good. Yeah, so this is really huge. Yeah.
Yeah, Nick.
What are they doing about, so it's using MDL, so we've got MDL claims, they're using, the references to digital travel credentials, so presumably that's in scope. What about other credential formats? The legislation talks about presenting education, certificates, health information. Is there any work being done on standardising the claims contents for those?
Yeah. There's.
For the PIT.
Right
now. So right now, you need to differentiate. So formats, to me, is the kind of a representation. So we talked about representations, either MDoc or SDJOT. There will be other formats as well, perhaps. And content-wise, for the PIT, there is a definition in the ARF about the claims.
Yeah, there is. That doesn't.
So there will be a document called Playbook that will have an actual claim name, like camel case, where there are other cases that will, ensure interoperability, that verifiers, issuers can understand the same claim as the same syntax, same semantics.
But do not expect the ARF to define the vocabulary of each possible EAA, because we don't know each possible EAA. So from my standpoint, the ARF should really provide the ground on which all kinds of different credentials can be used.
I agree with that. Someone needs to define if the EAA is going to be interoperable for, say, health or education. Someone's got to define that content.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, consortiums like EBSI defining schemas and all that. So there are efforts to guarantee interoperability in that regard as well. Yeah, last question, Rolf. Maintaining?
This is all domain specific. In the end, not only the definition of the schemes, even the management of the trust will be domain specific. Whether you are a lawyer, whether you are I don't know, right? Whether you're a university is completely different because there are different governance processes associated with that. So it's going to be fun. All right, so I have been asked to tell you or to remind you that there is dinner being served in the exposition hall, right, as an additional service. And if you want to learn more about OpenID for verifiable credentials, come to our show tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.